Picture a stretch of forest and marsh so vast it swallows the horizon in every direction. No roads, no capital, no king. Just scattered tribes who spend more energy fighting each other than farming their own fields. That's the land that would eventually become Russia, around the 9th century. And according to the old chronicles, the local tribes got so exhausted by their own infighting that they did something almost nobody in history has ever done voluntarily. They asked foreigners to come rule them. The foreigners they picked were Vikings, specifically a warrior named Rurik, who sailed in from Scandinavia, looked at the swampy, freezing territory he'd just inherited, and decided it was worth the trouble. His descendants built a trading state centered on the city of Kiev, known to history as Kievan Rus. It stretched from the Baltic coast down toward the Black Sea, and it thrived by connecting two giants, the Byzantine Empire to the south and the Viking world to the north. There was just one problem. The rest of Europe considered the Rus people backward, because they still worshipped old thunder gods while everyone else had signed on to a major world religion. So the ruling prince, Vladimir, decided it was time to shop for a new one. Legend says he brought in representatives from Islam, Judaism, and Christianity to make their case. Islam was out because it banned alcohol, and in a land this cold, that was a deal-breaker. Judaism was out because its people at that time had no state of their own. Christianity, tied to the wealth and grandeur of Byzantium, and notably not opposed to drinking, won by default. In the year 988, Vladimir was baptized, and his entire kingdom followed him into the new faith by royal decree. It should have been the foundation of something permanent. Instead, when Vladimir's bloodline ran out, the kingdom split apart into competing principalities, each ruled by a prince more interested in fighting his neighbor than defending the border. That fragmentation would turn out to be the worst possible timing, because something was approaching from the east that none of these squabbling princes were prepared for. In 1237, the horizon filled with riders. This was the army of Batu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, and by the time they reached Rus territory, the Mongols had already conquered more land than any empire before them. Their horsemen could cover 100 miles in a day and fire arrows with total accuracy at full gallop. City after city fell. Kiev, once the glittering capital of the Rus, was left in ashes so complete that travelers who passed through afterward described nothing but empty fields. For the next 2.5 centuries, Rus princes didn't rule independently. They ruled by permission. Each one had to travel to the Mongol court, kneel before the Khan, and beg for the right to govern his own town. Say the wrong thing, and you could be executed on the spot. But in the middle of all this humiliation, a small, unremarkable northern town began quietly playing a longer game. Moscow's princes took on the job of collecting tribute from other Rus territories on the Mongols' behalf, and skimmed a little extra off every collection for themselves. Not enough to get noticed, just enough to slowly, patiently get rich while everyone else stayed poor. By 1480, Mongol power had weakened enough that Moscow's ruler, Ivan III, simply refused to pay any more. Two armies faced off across a river, and after weeks of tense staring, the Mongol commander turned around and left without a single battle being fought. 240 years of domination ended not with a war, but with a retreat. Ivan promptly declared himself something grander than prince. He adopted the title Tsar, Russia's version of Caesar. His grandson Ivan IV inherited that throne in 1547 at just 16 years old, and for a while he was genuinely brilliant, reforming laws, founding schools, expanding Russian territory east. Then his wife died. He became convinced his own nobles had poisoned her, and he built a private army dressed in black to hunt down anyone he suspected of disloyalty. They rode the countryside torturing and executing nobles, merchants, sometimes entire towns. History remembers him as Ivan the Terrible, though the word terrible barely covers a man who, in a fit of rage, struck his own son with a staff and killed him, wiping out his own dynasty's future in a single moment of fury. With no clear heir, Russia collapsed into what its own people simply called the time of troubles: famine, plague, foreign invasion, and a parade of impostors claiming to be Ivan's dead son. Poland even installed its own puppet ruler in Moscow for a time. After 15 brutal years, exhausted nobles finally settled on a compromise nobody expected to last: a quiet 16-year-old named Mikhail Romanov. His family would rule Russia for the next 300 years. But the Russia the Romanovs inherited was falling further behind Europe by the decade. While other nations built ocean fleets, developed modern science, and expanded across the globe, Russia was still a land of serfs, peasants legally bound to the landowners who controlled them, and noblemen in old-fashioned robes and beards. Then in 1682, a boy was born who would refuse to accept that gap. Peter grew into a genuine giant, reportedly standing close to 6'8" in an era when the average man stood a foot shorter. He was obsessed with ships, engineering, and getting his hands dirty. When he became Tsar, he did something no Russian ruler had ever done. He left the country, traveling through Europe in disguise, working alongside shipwrights in Dutch dockyards to learn how a modern navy was actually built. He came home determined to drag Russia into the modern era, whether it wanted to go or not. He taxed noblemen who refused to shave their beards. He replaced traditional robes with European dress. He even reset the calendar overnight, jumping the country forward by thousands of years to align with the West. And in a mosquito-ridden swamp on the edge of the Baltic Sea, he ordered the construction of an entirely new capital city built at staggering human cost, St. Petersburg, a European window carved directly into Russia's northern coast. By the time Peter died in 1725, he had built a navy from nothing and transformed a medieval kingdom into a rising European power. After Peter's death, Russia drifted through decades of weak rulers and palace intrigue, until a sharp, ambitious German princess married into the royal family. Within 6 months of her husband's disastrous reign, Catherine had him overthrown with help from allies in the army and took the throne for herself. History remembers her as Catherine the Great, and she earned the title honestly, annexing Crimea from the Ottomans, absorbing large portions of what is now Ukraine, and carving up Poland alongside her rival powers. She corresponded with Europe's leading philosophers about liberty and reform, and dropped hints for years that she intended to free Russia's serfs. She never did. Then in 1812, Russia faced its first true existential test. Napoleon Bonaparte marched into the country with roughly 600,000 soldiers, the largest invasion force Europe had ever assembled. Russian forces retreated deeper and deeper into their own territory, refusing to fight the decisive battle Napoleon wanted. And when the French finally reached Moscow, they found the city burning and abandoned. There was nothing left to conquer, and nothing left to feed an army that size. Then the temperature dropped. Of the roughly 600,000 men who marched in, only a small fraction limped back out. The rest froze, starved, or were picked off by Russian partisans as they retreated through the same devastated country they had just conquered. Russia had beaten the most feared military commander in Europe using a weapon no army could out-strategize: its own winter. Victory over Napoleon didn't fix anything at home. Serfs were still serfs. The monarchy refused meaningful reform. By the time Nicholas II inherited the throne in 1894, Russia was a powder keg, and Nicholas, by nearly every account, was not the man to defuse it. Weak, indecisive, and easily influenced, he watched as his wife fell increasingly under the spell of a mystic named Rasputin, while factory workers starved and revolutionaries plotted in basements across the empire. Then in 1914, Nicholas made the decision that would end his dynasty. He took Russia into the First World War. The country was catastrophically unprepared. Soldiers were sent to the front without enough rifles, told to arm themselves with the weapons of the men who died before them. At the Battle of Tannenberg alone, Germany encircled and destroyed an entire Russian army, capturing or killing well over 100,000 men in a matter of days. Russia would go on to suffer more military deaths in that war than any other nation involved. By February 1917, starving, freezing, and furious, Russians rose up. Nicholas abdicated in a train car, quietly ending 300 years of Romanov rule. A shaky provisional government took over and made the fatal mistake of staying in the war everyone hated. Waiting in exile was a revolutionary named Vladimir Lenin, whose Bolshevik party offered a blunt, irresistible promise: peace, land, and bread. In October 1917, his forces walked into the seat of government in Petrograd and simply took it. Resistance was almost non-existent. Civil war followed, and when the fighting ended, Lenin's Bolsheviks had built something entirely new: the Soviet Union. After Lenin's death, a ruthless and paranoid Georgian named Joseph Stalin consolidated total control. He forced millions of farmers onto state-run collective farms, a policy that triggered famine and killed millions, especially in Ukraine. He purged the military and political establishment so thoroughly that by 1941, when Adolf Hitler launched a surprise invasion with roughly 3 million troops, the Soviet Union had lost many of its most experienced commanders to Stalin's own paranoia. What followed was almost unimaginable in scale. The siege of Leningrad alone lasted close to 900 days and killed roughly 1 million civilians through starvation. The Battle of Stalingrad became one of the deadliest single battles in human history. The Battle of Kursk, fought in 1943, remains the largest tank battle ever recorded. Slowly and at a staggering cost, the Red Army turned the tide and pushed Nazi forces all the way back to Berlin. By the war's end, the Soviet Union had lost an estimated 27 million people, more than any other nation in the conflict, and emerged as one of two global superpowers. For the next 45 years, the United States and the Soviet Union faced off in a war fought mostly through fear, proxy conflicts, and a stockpile of nuclear weapons capable of ending civilization several times over. The Cold War brought the world to the edge more than once, most famously during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. But perhaps the closest call came quietly, almost unnoticed, in September 1983. A Soviet officer named Stanislav Petrov was on duty at an early warning bunker outside Moscow when the system reported an American missile launch, then 4 more behind it. Protocol demanded he report it immediately, likely triggering a retaliatory strike. Petrov hesitated. He had a gut feeling the system was malfunctioning, since a real American first strike would almost certainly involve far more than 5 missiles. He was right. The satellites had mistaken sunlight reflecting off clouds for missile launches. Petrov's decision to wait, made in a matter of minutes, is widely credited with preventing a nuclear war that could have killed millions. But even as Soviet officers were making decisions like that, the system itself was crumbling from within: empty shelves, a stagnant economy, a population exhausted by decades of scarcity. When Mikhail Gorbachev took power in 1985 and tried to reform it with new openness and restructuring, the changes he unleashed spun rapidly out of his control. One by one, the Soviet Union's satellite states broke away. On December 25, 1991, the Soviet flag came down from the Kremlin for the final time, replaced by the Russian tricolor. No war, no coup, just one banner quietly swapped for another. The 1990s that followed were turbulent: economic collapse, organized crime, and state assets sold off for a fraction of their worth. In 1999, a former KGB officer named Vladimir Putin rose to the presidency and began consolidating control over the media, the courts, and his political opposition. In 2014, Russia annexed Crimea. In 2022, it launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And that's the throughline of the whole story. A country invited its own rulers, converted for wine, survived 2.5 centuries under foreign domination by playing the long game, burned its own capital rather than surrender it, lost more people in one war than almost any nation in history, and was saved from nuclear annihilation by one man's 15 seconds of doubt. 1,500 years, and the pattern never really changes. Russia gets broken, and Russia comes back.